June 4, 1942. Reinhard Heydrich dies in Prague 8 days after an attack carried out by 2 Czechoslovak agents, Jozef Gabcik and Jan Kubis, sent from London under Operation Anthropoid. A bomb thrown at his open-top car left him gravely wounded. For his wife, Lina Heydrich, and their 4 children, Klaus, Heider, Silke and Marte, the blow was not only personal. From that moment on, their stability became tied to a political decision.
Meine Arbeit für Richtigkeit.
Hitler guaranteed that they would retain their status, keep their residence in Czech territory, confiscated from a Jewish family after the occupation, and receive direct financial support from the Nazi state. 1 year after the attack, the family suffered a second blow. Klaus, the eldest son, died at just 10 years old after being struck by a truck near the estate. German authorities considered it a deliberate act of revenge against the Heydrich name. In 1954, a Munich court issued a ruling that shocked the vast majority of German public opinion. This is the story of those who carried on bearing the Heydrich name after his death in 1942. A widow and 4 children protected by the machinery of the Reich. How do Reinhard Heydrich's heirs live today? And what position do they take regarding their father's past? What plans for revenge were set in motion after his death? The influence of Lina Heydrich on the architect of the Holocaust and Hitler's promise. In late 1930, at a rowing club in Kiel, a northern German port city, Reinhard Heydrich met Lina von Osten during a social event organized for the naval elite and prominent families of the region. The encounter was neither accidental nor insignificant. Lina, a young woman with firmly defined political convictions and early sympathies for the National Socialist movement, recognized in the naval officer something beyond physical attractiveness or professional ambition. She saw discipline, calculated coldness, and a disposition for power that aligned with her own ideological inclinations. What followed was not a conventional romance, but the beginning of an alliance that would shape both Heydrich's meteoric rise within the machinery of Nazi terror and the fate of the family he would leave behind decades later. By the spring of 1931, that meeting had triggered unexpected consequences. Heydrich faced a naval investigation after it was discovered that he had formally become engaged to Lina while still bound by a prior engagement to another woman, the daughter of a shipyard director with significant industrial connections. The scandal was far from minor. The German Navy, heir to Prussian codes of honor and rigid hierarchical structures, did not tolerate such conduct among its officers. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, summoned Heydrich to a disciplinary hearing in April 1931. The outcome was final. Heydrich was dismissed from the Navy without the possibility of appeal, losing within weeks a career he had built over years, one that represented stability, prestige, and a predictable future in a Germany still mired in post-war economic crisis. That dismissal, which at first glance appeared to be a devastating personal humiliation, became the turning point that redirected his life onto a far darker path. Unemployed, without steady income, and with no immediate prospects in a labor market crippled by the Great Depression, Heydrich found himself in a desperate situation. Lina, far from distancing herself, became the decisive factor in what followed. She had cultivated connections within local National Socialist circles and new party members operating in northern Germany. It was she who suggested, encouraged, and ultimately facilitated the contact that would change everything. In June 1931, just 2 months after his naval expulsion, Heydrich joined the Nazi Party. Weeks later, he entered the SS, the elite paramilitary organization that Heinrich Himmler was transforming from a small personal guard for Hitler into the instrument of ideological control and systematic repression that would dominate the Third Reich. Himmler immediately recognized the potential of the unemployed young officer. Heydrich was not an impassioned ideological militant or a street fanatic. He was a technician of power, a meticulous organizer with military training, experience in naval intelligence, and an exceptional ability to structure systems of surveillance and control. In September 1931, Himmler tasked him with creating the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service. What began as a small internal counterintelligence office became, under Heydrich's direction, a vast espionage network that penetrated every layer of German society. Detailed files on political opponents, exhaustive records on potential enemies of the regime, systems of citizen denunciation, and systematic surveillance of the population became tools that the SD refined throughout the 1930s. On December 26, 1931, Reinhard and Lina were married in a ceremony held in a church in Grossenbrode, a small coastal village near Kiel. The wedding marked the formal beginning of a partnership that was far more than a personal bond. Lina was not a passive wife or a decorative figure confined to the domestic sphere. She shared her husband's ideological vision, actively participated in SS social circles, and played a crucial role in building the network of relationships that enabled Heydrich's meteoric ascent. Over the following years, as Germany moved from the collapse of the Weimar Republic toward the consolidation of the Nazi regime, the couple built a position of power that few within the apparatus of the Third Reich would ever attain. Between 1933 and 1939, Heydrich consolidated his control over the regime's repressive apparatus. After the Nazi seizure of power in January 1933, he was appointed head of the political police in Bavaria. He later extended his authority over the Gestapo and, in 1939, assumed leadership of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, a bureaucratic structure that unified the political police, criminal police, and intelligence service under a single command. From that position, Heydrich became one of the central architects of the Nazi terror system. He coordinated the SS, the Gestapo, and the police in the persecution of Jews, communists, social democrats, and any group deemed an enemy of the regime. He directly participated in planning Kristallnacht in November 1938, a coordinated wave of anti-Jewish violence that destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, and human lives across Germany. Later, in January 1942, he presided over the Wannsee Conference, where Nazi officials from various ministries coordinated the technical implementation of the final solution, the plan for the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. During those years, Lina and the children lived an existence marked by material privilege and selective social isolation. The family resided in Berlin in a state-provided home and enjoyed the economic and social benefits corresponding to Heydrich's rank within the Nazi hierarchy. By 1939, Lina had given birth to 3 children: Klaus, born in 1933, Heider the following year, and Silke in 1939. A 4th child, Marte, would arrive in 1942, just months before her father's death. Family life unfolded in an environment where the structures of terror and domestic routines coexisted without apparent contradiction. Lina organized social events for SS officers' families, participated in party women's organizations, and maintained a network of contacts that reinforced her husband's standing within the regime. In September 1941, Heydrich was appointed acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech territories occupied by Germany since March 1939. The appointment reflected Hitler's and Himmler's view that the previous administration had been too lenient and that Czech resistance was growing. Heydrich was sent to impose strict control, suppress any form of opposition, and ensure that the occupied territories continued to serve the economic and strategic interests of the Reich. In the months that followed, he implemented a policy of selective terror combined with limited economic concessions for loyal labor sectors. He ordered the execution of hundreds accused of resistance, dismantled underground networks, and strengthened the surveillance apparatus in Prague and other Czech cities. The Heydrich family moved to a confiscated property in Panenské Březany, known in German as Jungfernbreschan, located about 12 miles north of Prague. The estate had belonged to a Jewish family dispossessed after the German occupation. The property included a large mansion surrounded by gardens, stables, and extensive grounds. For Lina and the children, it represented a significant improvement over life in Berlin. The family enjoyed an isolated and privileged existence, surrounded by domestic staff and protected by SS guards. Lina assumed the role of hostess at events organized for Nazi officials stationed in the Protectorate, consolidating her position as a social figure within the regime's elite in the occupied territories. Yet the iron control Heydrich imposed on Bohemia and Moravia provoked a response. In London, the Czechoslovak government-in-exile, under President Edvard Beneš, authorized a high-risk operation aimed at eliminating the acting protector. The mission, known as Operation Anthropoid, was planned by the British Special Operations Executive in coordination with Czechoslovak forces in exile. On the morning of May 27, 1942, Heydrich was travelling from his residence in Panenské Březany to his office at Prague Castle in an open-top car, accompanied only by his driver. The decision to travel without armed escort and in an open vehicle reflected a combination of arrogance and confidence in the absolute control he believed he exercised over the territory. That confidence proved to be a fatal mistake. At a sharp bend in the Holesovice district where the vehicle had to slow down, the two agents carried out the attack. Gabcik attempted to fire a Sten submachine gun, but the weapon jammed. Kubis then threw a modified bomb that exploded near the vehicle, sending shrapnel and metal fragments into Heydrich's right side, penetrating his torso and lodging in his spleen and diaphragm. Heydrich survived the initial blast. He stepped out of the car, briefly attempted to pursue the attackers, and then collapsed from blood loss. He was taken to Bulovka Hospital in Prague, where German doctors performed emergency surgery to remove the shrapnel and repair the damaged organs. At first, it appeared he would recover. In the days following the operation, his condition stabilized and he received visits from Himmler and other high-ranking Nazi officials. However, he developed a severe infection, likely caused by fragments of upholstery from the car that had entered his body along with the shrapnel. Despite treatment with sulfonamides, the antibiotics available at the time, septicemia spread rapidly. On June 4, 1942, 8 days after the attack, Reinhard Heydrich died in Prague at the age of 38. His death triggered a brutal and immediate response from the Nazi regime. Hitler ordered massive reprisals against the Czech population. The SS summarily executed hundreds accused of collaborating with the resistance. On June 10, 1942, German forces surrounded the village of Lidice, falsely suspected of harboring the attackers. All men over the age of 16 were shot, the women deported to concentration camps, and the children separated and sent to institutions. The village was systematically razed, its structures demolished, and the site erased from official maps. Days later, the village of Ležáky suffered a similar fate. The reprisals continued for weeks, turning Heydrich's death into a turning point in the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. For Lina and her 4 children, the impact was immediate, though initially cushioned by the regime's protective structures. Hitler personally promised that the family would retain its position and property. The residence in Panenské Březany was confirmed as permanent family property, and Lina received assurances that the state would cover her financial needs. Heydrich's funeral was a massive event organized in Berlin with full Nazi state ceremony. Thousands of SS officers, party officials, and government representatives attended. Hitler, Himmler, and other leaders delivered speeches portraying Heydrich as a martyr of the Reich, an example of sacrifice and dedication to National Socialism. Lina attended the funeral surrounded by her children, publicly reinforcing the image of the loyal widow honoring her fallen husband. But that apparent stability was fragile. The world Heydrich had helped build was at total war, and the pillars supporting his family's privileged life would begin to erode as the Third Reich moved toward its inevitable collapse. The life of the Heydrich family after the collapse of the Reich and the tragedy of their son Klaus at the age of 10. Between June 1942 and the spring of 1945, the life of Lina Heydrich and her children unfolded in Panenské Březany within a bubble of privilege that was artificially sustained while the world around them crumbled. The estate included extensive farmland, carefully maintained gardens, stables with horses, and a spacious mansion with multiple rooms, a library, and salons intended for social life. There, Lina assumed the role of the widow of a fallen hero of the regime, organizing events for the families of SS officers stationed in the Protectorate and maintaining a network of relationships that reinforced her position within the Nazi elite in the occupied territories. Family routine combined elements of domestic normality with constant reminders of the political and repressive system that sustained their existence. The children grew up surrounded by Czech domestic staff working under German supervision, in an environment where the Czech language and local culture were tolerated only insofar as they served the practical needs of the occupation. Klaus, the eldest son, had reached the age of 9 at the time of his father's death. Heider was 8 years old. Silke, the only daughter at that time, was just 3 when her father died. Marte, the fourth and youngest child, was born only a month after Heydrich's death, having never known her father. For Lina, those years represented a continuation of the life she had built alongside Reinhard, though now without his physical presence. She maintained regular contact with Heinrich Himmler, who had become a kind of institutional protector of the family, ensuring that the promises made by Hitler were fulfilled. The letters exchanged between Lina and Himmler during that period reflect a complex relationship marked by gratitude, dependence, and also by Lina's determination to preserve what she considered her rightful due as the widow of a high-ranking official of the Reich. In those communications, Lina expressed no regret or questioning of the regime or of the role her husband had played. On the contrary, she reinforced her ideological loyalty and her commitment to the world that Heydrich had helped build. However, the structures sustaining that privileged existence began to fracture as the war turned against Germany. By the end of 1943, the Eastern Front had collapsed following the defeat at Stalingrad, and Soviet forces were advancing inexorably westward. In 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy opened a second front that accelerated the military encirclement of the Third Reich. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech resistance, though severely repressed after the reprisals in Lidice and Ležáky, continued to operate clandestinely, sabotaging railway infrastructure, attacking German convoys and providing intelligence to the Allies. The German occupation, which Heydrich had ruled with an iron hand, began to lose cohesion as military resources were diverted to combat fronts and administrative control deteriorated. In October 1943, the Heydrich family suffered a personal tragedy that deeply marked Lina. Klaus, the eldest son, died in a traffic accident near the Panenské Břežany estate. The 10-year-old boy was riding his bicycle along a local road when he collided with a delivery truck. The collision was fatal. Klaus died at the scene of the accident. The news devastated Lina, who had projected onto her eldest son the expectations of continuity for the family legacy and the memory of his father. Hitler personally sent his condolences, and several high-ranking SS officials attended the funeral held in Prague. The burial included military honors and speeches that portrayed the boy's death as a loss for the SS community, reinforcing the narrative that the Heydrich family occupied a special place within the regime. Klaus's death intensified Lina's emotional isolation, but it did not alter her ideological loyalty or her determination to maintain the family's status. Throughout 1944, as Soviet forces advanced toward Czechoslovakia from the east and Allied bombings intensified the destruction of German cities, Lina continued residing in Panenské Břežany, apparently trusting that the Reich would find a way to reverse the course of the war. That confidence was shared by broad sectors of the Nazi elite, who had built their entire lives on the premise of the system's invincibility and resisted accepting that collapse was inevitable. By the spring of 1945, that denial was no longer sustainable. In April, Soviet forces had penetrated deep into Czechoslovak territory, liberating cities and towns as they advanced toward Prague. The Czech population, which had endured years of brutal occupation, began organizing for an insurrection that would culminate in the Prague Uprising in May 1945. The German administrative structures in the Protectorate collapsed within days. Nazi officials, SS officers, and German settlers who had occupied confiscated properties fled en masse toward the west, attempting to reach zones that would be occupied by American or British forces rather than Soviet troops. Panic was widespread. Columns of German refugees mixed with military units in disorganized retreat clogged the roads leading toward Bavaria and Austria. Lina Heydrich, together with her 3 surviving children, Heider, Silke, and Marte, joined that mass exodus. They left Panenské Břežany carrying only portable belongings, personal documents, and a few valuables that might prove useful in the uncertain future they faced. The estate was left behind, destined to be confiscated by Czechoslovak authorities once the country's government was restored. The journey westward was chaotic and dangerous. The roads were overcrowded, Allied bombings continued to strike moving columns, and Soviet forces advanced rapidly, capturing or killing those who failed to escape in time. Lina and the children crossed the border into Bavaria in the final weeks of April 1945, just before Germany signed its unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. Upon arriving in territory soon to be occupied by American forces, Lina and her children found themselves in a situation radically different from anything they had ever known. There was no property, no institutional protection, no network of SS officers to rely on. The world that Heydrich had helped build had collapsed completely. By the end of 1945, the family had temporarily settled in Aschau im Chiemgau, a small village in the Bavarian Alps. There, they depended on assistance provided by local authorities to German refugees, small financial aid, and the limited support of distant relatives. From living in a confiscated mansion with domestic staff and material privileges, they now inhabited temporary accommodations under precarious conditions, without stable income and surrounded by thousands of other displaced Germans who had also lost everything. But material collapse was only the beginning. What followed would be a long, bureaucratic and humiliating process that forced Lina to justify her past, defend her right to receive state support, and navigate a legal system designed to judge and classify those who had participated in the Nazi regime. Denazification was not a single event, but a process that extended over years and would profoundly shape the future of the Heydrich family. Lina Heydrich tried in the courts and the denazification process. Denazification was the process through which the Allied occupying powers sought to identify, prosecute, and reintegrate millions of Germans who had participated in the Nazi regime at different levels. For Lina Heydrich, that process began in 1946 and extended over several years, becoming a central element that defined her post-war life. The denazification tribunals in the American occupation zone, which included Bavaria, classified individuals into 5 categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. The classification determined the applicable sanctions, ranging from professional bans, confiscation of property, and financial fines, to prison sentences in severe cases. Lina faced her first hearings in 1946. Investigators examined her political record in detail. They discovered that she had joined the Nazi Party in 1931, long before Hitler came to power in 1933. That early affiliation was interpreted as evidence of genuine ideological conviction, not later opportunism or forced adherence. Interrogators also documented her active participation in the party's women's organizations, her role as hostess at social events for the SS elite, and the material benefits she had received during the Third Reich, including residence on confiscated property in occupied territory. All this information was compiled into case files that would serve as the basis for determining her level of responsibility. During the interrogations, Lina adopted a line of defense she would maintain for decades. She claimed that her political involvement had been superficial and motivated solely by youthful idealism. She denied having detailed knowledge of her husband's activities, presenting herself as a devoted wife focused on raising her children and managing household duties without influence or involvement in the regime's political or administrative decisions. When asked about the Wannsee Conference, the mass deportations of Jews, or the executions in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Lina insisted that Reinhard had never discussed his work with her, that she had lived on the margins of those events, and that she could not be held responsible for decisions made by her husband in his official capacity. Investigators found no direct evidence that Lina had personally participated in war crimes or in the regime's administrative decisions. There were no documents linking her to deportation orders or executions. However, prosecutors argued that her position as the wife of one of the central architects of the Holocaust, her presence at official events, her participation in SS social networks, and the material advantages she had enjoyed made her a conscious beneficiary of the system, not a victim or a passive observer. That argument faced legal limitations. The denazification tribunals operated under defined criteria that required concrete proof of active participation, not merely marital association or indirect benefit. In 1949, after several years of proceedings, Lina was classified as a Mitläuferin, that is, a follower or passive collaborator. This category was the second least severe within the classification system and entailed limited financial penalties and temporary professional restrictions, but did not include prison sentences or total confiscation of property. The decision sparked controversy. Sectors of German public opinion and groups representing victims of Nazism considered the classification excessively lenient, arguing that the widow of Reinhard Heydrich could not be treated as a mere follower without significant responsibility. Others defended the verdict, pointing out that the tribunals had acted in accordance with the law and that there was insufficient evidence for a harsher classification. However, the designation as a Mitläuferin did not resolve Lina's financial difficulties. During the second half of the 1940s, she relied on social assistance, state subsidies for war widows, and occasional support from relatives. This precarious situation led her in 1948 to initiate legal proceedings aimed at obtaining a widow's pension under German legislation recognizing benefits for the families of military personnel who had died in service. The case raised a complex legal question. Reinhard Heydrich had held the rank of SS Obergruppenführer and General of Police, positions that did not clearly fit within the traditional categories of the German armed forces. Widows' pension legislation applied to members of the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the Luftwaffe, but the legal relationship between the SS and the regular armed forces was ambiguous. Some SS officials had received equivalent ranks within the Wehrmacht, while others, including Heydrich, operated primarily within party and police structures. The central question was whether Heydrich, in his capacity as head of the RSHA and acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia, could be considered a member of the military on active duty at the time of his death in 1942. Lina argued that her husband had exercised national security functions equivalent to military duties, that he had been attacked by enemy agents in a wartime operation, and that his death had been officially recognized by the Nazi regime as a combat casualty. She presented documentation including the military honors at his funeral, Hitler's condolences, and public statements by high-ranking officials who had portrayed Heydrich as a fallen soldier of the Reich. Her lawyer maintained that denying the pension on political or moral grounds would violate the principle of legality, since the law did not explicitly exclude SS officers who had performed security functions. The proceedings lasted for years. Hearings included testimony from experts in military law, analysis of the organizational structure of the SS, and debates over the legal nature of the functions performed by Heydrich. Prosecutors argued that granting a pension to his widow would amount to retrospectively legitimizing war crimes. In 1954, the Munich court issued a ruling that provoked public outrage. The judges determined that Reinhard Heydrich, in his capacity as head of the RSHA, had held a rank that met the formal requirements to be considered a member of the German state's security forces, equivalent to military functions under the applicable legislation. Therefore, Lina was entitled to receive a widow's pension under the law. The judgment emphasized that the court was not issuing a moral assessment of Heydrich or of the actions of the Nazi regime, but rather applying technical criteria established in the existing legal framework. The decision triggered intense debate in the German press and in political circles. Groups representing victims of Nazism, Jewish organizations, and sectors of the political left denounced the ruling as evidence of continuity between the legal structures of the Third Reich and the Federal Republic of Germany. They argued that German courts were more concerned with formal legality than with historical justice, allowing the families of war criminals to benefit from a system that should have categorically excluded them. For Lina, the pension represented economic stability for the first time since 1945. With regular income secured, she was able to plan a less precarious future for herself and her children. Yet that stability came with a public stigma that would never fully disappear. The island of Fehmarn, the secret refuge for former SS members. In the mid-1950s, the family settled on the island of Fehmarn, located in the Baltic Sea off the northern coast of West Germany. Fehmarn was a modest tourist destination, known for its beaches, its tranquility, and its relative isolation from Germany's major urban centers. For Lina, the island offered the possibility of living with a degree of privacy far from Bavaria, where her name had been associated with denazification trials, and far from Berlin or Prague, where the memory of Reinhard Heydrich remained a politically explosive subject. On Fehmarn, Lina opened a boarding house called Imbria, a small lodging establishment that became her primary source of income in addition to her widow's pension. The guest house mainly catered to German tourists who visited the island during the summer months, offering modest rooms, breakfast, and a family-style atmosphere. To occasional visitors, Lina was simply a local business owner, a widow who had lost her husband during the war and was trying to make an honest living. However, within certain circles, the Imbria guest house acquired a different reputation. It became a discreet meeting point for former SS members, families of Nazi officers, and far-right sympathizers who found in Lina a figure who had not renounced her ideological past. Several intelligence reports from West German authorities during the 1960s and 1970s documented visits from individuals with backgrounds linked to the Nazi regime. Lina maintained contact with informal networks of former SS members and occasionally took part in private gatherings where topics related to the memory of the Third Reich were discussed, along with the perceived injustices of the Nuremberg trials and narratives portraying Germans as victims in the post-war period. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Lina granted several interviews to journalists and writers interested in her story. Her willingness to speak publicly varied depending on the context and the interviewer, but when she agreed, her statements reflected unwavering loyalty to her husband and a consistent refusal to question the legacy of the Nazi regime. In those conversations, Lina described Reinhard as a dedicated, disciplined man loyal to his country, emphasizing his personal qualities as a husband and father, while minimizing or directly denying his role in the Holocaust and in the repressive policies of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. One of the most extensively documented interviews was conducted by American journalist Nancy Doherty, who visited Fehmarn in the late 1970s and held lengthy recorded conversations with Lina, later cited in the article Interview with the Hangman's Wife, published in specialized outlets focused on historical crimes. In those recordings, Lina appeared as a woman with a sharp memory, able to recall dates, names, and details of events that had taken place decades earlier with precision. However, her narrative contained strategic omissions and reinterpretations that contradicted well-established documentary evidence. When asked about the Wannsee Conference or the mass executions ordered after the attack on Reinhard, Lina responded that those events had been exaggerated by Allied propaganda, or that Reinhard had acted under superior orders without significant personal responsibility. These statements generated mixed reactions. Historians and Holocaust survivors sharply criticized the interviews, arguing that Lina was perpetuating historical denialism and that the media should not provide platforms for such discourse. Other analysts considered the interviews to have documentary value precisely because they revealed the persistence of ideological loyalties among followers of Nazism decades after the regime's fall, offering a window into the mindset of those who had undergone no genuine process of reckoning with the past. In 1976, Lina published her memoirs under the title Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. The book was released by a small German publishing house and had limited circulation, but it generated significant media attention. In her memoir, Lina portrayed Reinhard as a dedicated official who had been unjustly demonized by the Allies, as a loving husband and devoted father, and as a victim of the political circumstances of his time. The book included family anecdotes, descriptions of daily life in Berlin and in Panensky Brezhany, and reflections on the emotional impact of Reinhard's death and the collapse of the Third Reich. Reviews of the book were largely negative. Some critics went further, arguing that it was not merely a personal memoir but a deliberate attempt to rehabilitate Heydrich's image and cast doubt on the established historical narrative. However, the book also found sympathetic readers, primarily within far-right circles where Heydrich's figure continued to be admired. During the 1980s, Lina's health began to deteriorate. She continued operating the Imbria guest house with the help of relatives and employees, but her ability to actively manage the business declined. She received occasional visits from journalists, researchers, and, to a lesser extent, former acquaintances from the years of the Third Reich. In 1985, at 73 years of age, Lina Heydrich died in Fehmarn. Her death did not generate significant headlines in the German or international press, but it was noted in publications specializing in the history of Nazism and in academic circles tracking the fate of families of high-ranking Nazi officials. Lina's legacy remains the subject of debate. For some historians, she represents an emblematic case of denial and enduring ideological loyalty, a reminder that denazification was an incomplete process that allowed individuals with deeply rooted Nazi convictions to reintegrate into German society without undergoing genuine transformation. For others, Lina symbolizes the complexities of collective memory in Germany, where personal narratives, legal justice, and historical responsibility collided in ways the judicial and political system did not always manage effectively. Beyond interpretation, what remains clear is that Lina lived for 40 years after the war without substantially altering her convictions, without expressing public remorse for the regime her husband had served, and without acknowledging the massive suffering that regime had caused. That stance had consequences not only for her own life, but also for the way her children navigated the decades that followed, carrying a surname that for millions of people around the world remained synonymous with terror and fear. The children of Heydrich, Klaus, Heider, Silke, and Marte. The three surviving children of Reinhard Heydrich, Heider, Silke, and Marte, faced the post-war years and the decades that followed in radically different ways, shaped by personal choices, social pressures, and the constant weight of a surname they could neither change nor escape. Klaus Heydrich, born in June 1933, was the firstborn son of Reinhard and Lina. By October 1943, when his death occurred, he was 10 years old and had grown up in the privileged environment befitting the family of a high-ranking SS official. Klaus had spent his early years in Berlin, where his father consolidated control over the Gestapo and the SD, and later moved with the family to the confiscated estate in Panensky Brezany after Reinhard was appointed acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia. For a child his age, life on the estate represented an almost idyllic existence. Vast grounds to explore, horses, domestic staff attending to every need, and the sense of security provided by the absolute power his father exercised over the occupied territory. On October 24, 1943, Klaus left the family property on his bicycle to ride along the nearby country roads, an activity he frequently enjoyed and one that caused no particular concern for his mother or the guards assigned to the family. However, on a stretch of road near the village of Jungfernbrechen, Klaus collided head-on with a delivery truck traveling in the opposite direction. The exact circumstances of the accident were never fully clarified. Some later reports suggested that the boy attempted to overtake another vehicle and lost control of his bicycle. Others stated that the truck had partially crossed into the opposite lane on a curve. The news reached Lina within minutes. The truck driver, a Czech worker employed by a German transport company, was immediately detained by local authorities and subjected to interrogation. It was determined that there was no evidence of intent or gross negligence and that the accident resulted from a combination of excessive speed on the driver's part and a reckless maneuver by the child. However, the investigation unfolded under the shadow of Nazi paranoia regarding acts of resistance and sabotage. For days, German authorities considered the possibility that the accident had been deliberately caused as an act of revenge against the Heydrich family. Klaus's funeral was held in Prague with honors befitting his status as the son of the late acting protector. Adolf Hitler personally sent a message of condolence to Lina, expressing his sorrow for the loss and recalling Reinhard's sacrifice for the Reich. Heinrich Himmler attended the funeral alongside several high-ranking SS officers, turning the event into a public display of the institutional support the regime continued to extend to the Heydrich family. The coffin was draped with a Nazi flag, and an SS detachment rendered military honors during the ceremony. For Lina, Klaus's death represented not only a devastating personal loss, but also the shattering of the expectations she had placed upon her eldest son as the future bearer of the family legacy. In interviews conducted decades later, Lina repeatedly referred to Klaus's death as one of the most painful moments of her life, equating it emotionally with Reinhard's death. With Klaus's death, Heider automatically became the eldest surviving son, and thus the principal male bearer of the Heydrich surname in his generation. Born in December 1934, Heider was just 7 years old when his father died in June 1942. His direct memories of Reinhard were fragmented and limited, shaped more by the narratives his mother constantly repeated than by meaningful personal experiences. During the final years of the war, between 1943 and 1945, Heider lived at the Panensky Brezany estate in an increasingly tense environment, as reports from the front detailed German defeats and the military encirclement of the Third Reich tightened. After the family fled to Bavaria in April 1945 and settled in Aschau im Chiemgau, Heider began his formal education within the post-war German school system. The transition was not easy. The Heydrich surname was already publicly known in Germany, directly associated with one of the most notorious Nazi war criminals. In school, Heider faced rejection, ridicule, and social isolation from classmates whose parents had been victims of the Nazi regime or who simply did not want their children associated with the family of a war criminal. At the same time, there were sectors of Bavarian society, particularly in rural and conservative areas, where covert Nazi sympathies persisted and where the Heydrich name did not automatically provoke rejection. During the 1950s, while Lina struggled to secure her widow's pension and faced denazification proceedings, Heider completed his secondary education and chose to study engineering, a technical field that would allow him to build a professional life without relying on political connections or public exposure. The decision to pursue engineering was not accidental. Unlike fields such as law, history, or political science, where his surname might have sparked constant debate about the Nazi past, engineering offered a seemingly neutral, technical, and apolitical space where his professional abilities could be measured without constant reference to his father. Heider worked for decades as an engineer in German companies, maintaining an entirely discreet profile and systematically rejecting any requests for interviews or participation in documentaries, books, or journalistic projects related to the memory of the Third Reich. This strategy of invisibility proved extraordinarily effective. Unlike other children of Nazi war criminals who became public figures, either condemning their parents or defending them, Heider managed for more than half a century to live a conventional professional and family life without his surname attracting constant media attention. However, this public silence did not necessarily imply a stance of distance from his father. In private, Heider maintained an image of Reinhard Heydrich shaped primarily by Lina's narratives. Heider's public silence was partially broken in 2009 when he agreed to speak with John Martin, a British historian researching Operation Anthropoid for his book The Mirror Caught the Sun. According to Martin's account, Heider was 75 at the time and accepted the interview on the condition that no recent photographs of him or details about his specific place of residence be published. During the conversation, Heider adopted a clearly defensive position regarding his father. When Martin specifically asked about the Wannsee Conference, where Reinhard had presided over the meeting that coordinated the administrative implementation of the Holocaust, Heider responded that his father had been a technical organizer following superior orders, not the ideologue behind the policy. The most significant break in Heider's silence occurred in 2011, when it became public that he had offered financial support for the restoration of the former family residence in Panensky Brezany. The property, confiscated by the Czechoslovak state after 1945, had remained for decades in a state of neglect and deterioration. By 2011, the building had severe structural damage. The roof was leaking, windows were broken, and vegetation had overtaken the gardens. Various Czech organizations had proposed projects to convert the property into a museum dedicated to documenting the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia and the atrocities committed under Reinhard Heydrich's rule, but none of these projects had secured sufficient funding. Heider, then 77 years old, contacted Czech authorities through legal intermediaries and offered a significant sum specifically designated for the architectural restoration of the building. He argued that allowing the structure to collapse would mean losing an important documentary source for the historical education of future generations. The proposal triggered an immediate and largely negative reaction in the Czech Republic. Several commentators pointed out that a restoration financed by the perpetrator's son could transform the site into a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis and Third Reich nostalgists, turning what should be a memorial to the victims into a monument to the executioner. The local authorities of Panensky Brezany rejected the offer. The town's mayor issued a public statement noting that, while preserving the building was desirable, the involvement of the Heydrich family in the process was ethically and politically unacceptable. He added that any restoration should be carried out under Czech state control and with funds not associated with sources linked to the Nazi regime. Heider did not issue extensive public statements following the rejection of his offer. Through his legal representatives, he expressed disappointment at what he considered a misinterpretation of a gesture intended solely for historical preservation. After the 2011 controversy, Heider once again withdrew from public scrutiny. The case of Silke Heydrich, the third child born in October 1939, represents a radical contrast to that of her brother Heider. Silke appears to have chosen a strategy of almost complete disappearance from the public record. Some reports, cited in German newspaper articles from the 1990s, state that Silke emigrated to the United States at some point during the 1960s or 1970s. According to those sources, she adopted her husband's surname after marriage, thereby severing any public connection to the Heydrich name. Other reports suggest that she may have settled in South America, where communities of German emigrants, some with past ties to Nazism, had established themselves after the war. However, none of these claims has been verified through official documentation, accessible migration records, or direct testimony. The near-total absence of information about Silke can be interpreted in various ways. Marte Heydrich, the youngest daughter, born in July 1942, just 1 month after her father's death, represents a different case from that of her siblings. Marte never knew Reinhard Heydrich. This absence of direct experience profoundly shaped the way she related to her surname in the decades that followed. After marriage, she adopted the surname Bayer, which she continues to use today. She settled in Fehmarn, the same Baltic Sea island where her mother Lina had operated the Imbria guest house for decades. This geographical choice was not accidental. Fehmarn represented a familiar environment, a place where Marte had spent part of her youth and where there existed a network of acquaintances who remembered her as Lina's daughter, not necessarily as Reinhard's. On the island, Marte opened a small clothing shop that she operated for years, maintaining an entirely discreet profile and avoiding any participation in public debates about the Third Reich or the memory of her father. She has maintained an almost absolute distance from her father's legacy. The few public statements attributed to her reflect more the psychological burden of carrying that surname than a defined ideological position. In a brief interview given to the German magazine Stern in the 1990s, Marte spoke candidly about the difficulty of living under the shadow of the Heydrich name. She stated that people cannot imagine what it means to have a father like Reinhard, that the name constantly pursues her, and that she never had the opportunity to know him personally in order to form an opinion based on direct experience. These statements are significant because they reflect a fundamentally different position from that of her mother Lina and her brother Heider. Marte did not actively defend her father, did not question the established historical narrative regarding his crimes, nor attempt to rehabilitate his image. Her stance was that of someone caught between a past she did not choose and a present she cannot entirely separate from that past without finding a satisfactory resolution to that tension. In Fehmarn, Marte lives today under the surname Bayer, running her business and maintaining a private existence. She does not grant interviews, participate in documentaries, or publish memoirs or extensive statements about her family. The third generation of the Heydrich family has added new layers of complexity to the family legacy. Marte has a son named Reinhard, who bears the same name as his grandfather. The decision to retain that name, presumably made by Marte and her husband decades after the war, is in itself significant. Some interpret it as a gesture of family continuity, a way of honoring the memory of a deceased relative regardless of his historical legacy. Others see it as an unnecessary provocation. Reinhard Heydrich, the grandson, has made only very limited statements to German media in recent decades. In an interview cited in various newspaper articles, he expressed the view that no one truly knows the full extent of what his grandfather did, suggesting that there may be room for doubt regarding the scope of his responsibility. The most striking contrast within the extended Heydrich family comes from Peter Thomas Heydrich, the son of Heinz Heydrich, Reinhard's younger brother. Peter Thomas, who is not a direct descendant of Reinhard but his nephew, has adopted a radically different stance from that of Reinhard's children. In public statements made in interviews and through participation in historical documentaries, Peter Thomas has openly criticized the way Reinhard's children have handled their father's legacy. According to Peter Thomas, it is regrettable that Heider, Silke and Marte have never publicly distanced themselves from Reinhard's actions nor acknowledged, even symbolically, the suffering endured under his authority. Peter Thomas argues that silence is not a neutral position, but rather implies a form of passive complicity with a past that should be unequivocally condemned. He has pointed out that other descendants of Nazi war criminals have found ways to confront that legacy publicly, whether through statements, participation in educational initiatives, or donations to Holocaust victim organizations, and that Reinhard Heydrich's direct family has followed none of those paths. These differences in perspective within the extended family are revealing. They demonstrate that there is no single or inevitable response to how descendants of perpetrators should relate to the past. Individual choices vary according to factors such as generational proximity, the influence of family narratives transmitted orally, the social context in which each person grew up, and conscious decisions regarding moral responsibility and public positioning. What is indisputable is that none of Reinhard Heydrich's direct children became involved in far-right political activism, neo-Nazism, or organized attempts to publicly rehabilitate their father's image through political platforms. Unlike documented cases in which descendants of Nazis became active defenders of totalitarian ideologies, the Heydrich children largely chose silence, privacy, and the construction of conventional lives away from public scrutiny. That choice, while it does not eliminate questions about historical responsibility, distinguishes them from those descendants who have used their surname to promote extremist political agendas. However, silence is not morally neutral. In a context where the Holocaust continues to be denied or minimized by sectors of the far right, where survivors and their descendants continue to struggle for recognition and reparation, and where historical memory remains a constant political battleground, the absence of public acknowledgement by the direct descendants of one of the principal architects of extermination carries implications that extend beyond the personal. The Heydrich family case raises fundamental questions that democratic societies continue to debate. What is expected of the descendants of perpetrators? Is public distancing a moral obligation or an unfair expectation? Can silence be interpreted as complicity? Are there appropriate ways to honor the memory of a relative without minimizing his crimes? These questions have no simple or universal answers. What the Heydrich case demonstrates is that the impact of the Third Reich's crimes did not end with the generations that perpetrated or directly suffered them, but extended across decades, affecting the lives of descendants who carry a name that history has judged definitively. The way each of Reinhard Heydrich's children chose to navigate that burden, from Heider's guarded defense to Silke's near-total disappearance to Marte's uneasy silence, reflects the complexity of processing traumatic historical legacies within the realm of individual and family life.